Thank you to all of you for being here as we celebrate Jean Kwok and our writers Lisa Ko and Marie Lee here. I have the pleasure of introducing our first reader today, Lisa Ko. Lisa Ko's The Leavers, a finalist for the National Book Award, explores the disappearance of Deming Guo's mother, Polly, an undocumented Chinese immigrant. A co-founder of Hyphen, Lisa has been awarded fellowships and residencies from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, the MacDowell Colony, and elsewhere. She is a former AAWW Van Lier Fellow and past editor of AAWW's member magazine, 10. Read her in AAWW's The Margins and talking about AAWW in Pen 10. Lisa is also a current New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow. Please give Lisa a hand.
Oh, hi, everyone. Wait, I hear this like lifts magically. Oh, wow. So cool. Thanks, Tiffany. So good to be here and see all your faces tonight. Love for the Asian American Writers Workshop, as always. Thanks, Marie, for being here and flying back from Wyoming. And thanks, of course, to Jean for inviting me to be part of this New York launch for Searching for Sylvie Lee, which is so fantastic and I'm so excited is out in the world for everyone to read. So I was looking for a few short passages to read tonight from The Leavers that kind of had similar themes to the ones in Jean's book. And it actually was really easy because I feel a lot of our work has a lot of these themes in common. So things about language and perception and, intergenerational immigrant families, and also this kind of Asian American or immigrant double consciousness where, characters are kind of seen one way and that's really different from the way they see themselves. So I'm just going to read two short passages. The first is from chapter 3. This is actually, as Tiffany mentioned in the intro, the book is about Polly Guo and her son Deming, and they get separated and find their way back to one another. And this scene is when Deming is 6 years old. He's actually just returned to New York City from spending a few years in China being taken care of by his grandfather. So he's kind of meeting his mom again, kind of for the first time since he was a baby. She promised she'd never leave him again on the day they found their doppelgangers. Back then, 6-year-old Deming and his mother were still strangers to one another, but formed a satisfying pair. The same wide noses and curly smiles, big dark pupils, underlined with slivers of white, a bit of lazy in their gaze. Her hand was foreign in his. He was used to his grandfather's warmer grip and more deliberate walk. His mother was too fast, too loud, like the American city he'd been dumped back into. And Deming missed a village, its muted gradients of grass and water, greens and blues, burgundies and grays. New York City was shiny, sharp, with riots of colors, and everywhere the indecipherable chatter of English. His eyes ached. His mouth filled with noise. The air was so cold it hurt to inhale, and the sky was crammed with buildings. He'd sought comfort in something familiar. He heard melodies in everything, and with them saw colors, his body gravitating to rhythm the way a plant arched up to the light. Crossing Bowery, he felt the soothing repetition of his feet hitting the sidewalk, his left hand connected to his mother's right, his 2 steps to her every one. She launched into the crosswalk. It was her one day off in 2 weeks. Deming examined the sidewalk droppings, cigarette butts and smeary napkins, and exposed between chunks of ice, so much gum. Who chewed these gray-pink wads? He had never chewed gum, and neither had his mother, to his knowledge, or any of her 6 roommates in their apartment on Rutgers Street. They stood before the subway map with its long, noodly lines. So what color should we do today? His mother asked. Deming studied the words he couldn't read, the places he'd yet to go, and pointed to purple. He'd been born here in Manhattan, Chinatown, but his mother had sent him to live with his grandfather when he was a year old, in the village where she had grown up. And it was Yikung who starred in Deming's earliest memories, who called him Little Fatty and taught him how to paddle a boat, collect a chicken egg, and gut a fish with the tip of a rusty knife. There were other children like him in Minjiang, American-born, cared for by grandparents, with parents they only knew from the telephone. "I'll send for you," the voice would say, But why would he want to go live with a voice, leave what he knew for a person he didn't remember? Each morning, he awoke to Yikung sweeping the front of their house. Yikung's wheezing, silver smoke rings dissolving skyward, until the morning Yikung didn't wake up, and then Deming was on a plane next to an uncle he would never see again. And a woman was hugging him in a cold apartment full of bunk beds, her face only familiar because it resembled his. He wanted to go home, and she told him the bunk bed was home. He didn't want to listen, but she was all he had. That was 2 weeks ago. Now he sat in a classroom every day at a school on Henry Street, not understanding anything his teacher said. They had traveled to Queens from one Chinese neighborhood to another, and when they emerged from the subway, the buildings were lower and the streets wider, but the crowds and languages were similar, and despite the cold air, Deming could smell familiar aromas of vegetables and fish. It was a frigid, hard bite of a winter afternoon. Stopping at a corner, his mother introduced a new game. There could be a Mama and Deming who live here too, another version of us. Like a best friend, but better, like a brother, a cleaved self. They chose the building this Mama and Deming would live in, a short one with a flat front like theirs on Rutgers Street, and watch mothers and children walk along the sidewalk until they found a boy Deming's age and a woman his mother's height. Her hair also cut so it settled in wisps against her skin. Like his mother, she wore a navy blue coat, and she could be mistaken for her son's older sister. "Can't we ask them to come over?" he asked. "We shouldn't disturb them. They're busy, but let's watch them, okay?" She steered him into a bakery, and he begged for an egg tart. She said no. Sometimes Yikung had let him guzzle Cokes for breakfast, but his mother never bought him anything. "I want to meet them." He stomped his boot on the floor. Again, she said no. He tore down the sidewalk after them. "Wait," he yelled. They turned around. They knew Fujianese. The other Mama was older and skinnier, and the other Deming was 8 or 9 and not 5 or 6, square-faced and squinty-eyed, like the kind of boy who might light bugs on fire for kicks. A fat crumb of pastry dangled from his bottom lip. In the moment before his mother yanked him away, Deming met the other Deming's eyes, and the other Deming said, in English, "Hi?" Then they walked off, fading into a sea of winter coats. "They're gone," Deming said. They left. Frightened, he longed for Yikung. "Are you going to leave me again?" "Never." His mother took his hand and swung it up and down. "I promise I'll never leave you." But one day she did. And I'm going to end with another section from a few chapters later. This chapter takes place actually when Deming is 11 years old, and his mother has gone to work one day, never come home. So he's left with no one to take care of him, and eventually he's taken in first as foster parents, then as adoptive parents by a couple named Peter and Kay Wilkinson, two white upper middle class professors who move him from the Bronx to a very small town in upstate New York where there are no other Asian people. And they end up changing his name to Daniel Wilkinson in a very misguided attempt to have him fit in more. And meanwhile, he's kind of left not knowing what happened to his mom. So here he is at his new home in Ridgeboro. The first days that he's arrived there, he's 11 and he's just going through a lot of confusion and trauma. 1 week later, tucked into a double bed, sheathed with red flannel, Deming Guo awoke with the crumbs of dialect on his tongue. Smudges and smears of dissolving syllables, nouns and verbs washed out to sea. One language had outsleeped another. New York City had provided him with an arsenal of new words. He'd bled English vowels and watched his mother's face fall. He wrapped the blankets tighter around him, cold even in late August. The white clapboard house in Ridgeboro, New York, population 6,525, 5 hours northwest of the city, was nearly 200 years old, Peter said, an antique. 5 times the size of the Bronx apartment, 7 times the size of the house on 3 Alley. 3 big bedrooms, 1 for Kay and Peter, 1 for Deming, and a 3rd for guests, a bed chubby with quilts and pillows in which nobody ever slept. A breeze snaked in through the oversized windows. The beanbags that lay across the bottoms of doors could not ward off this draft. "I am Daniel Wilkinson." He shivered. He had never slept alone before, never had a room to himself, all this vast, empty space. Deming heard a toot-toot of a whistle. Peter was in the dorm frame, hands on hips. "Good morning, Daniel." It always took a second to realize they were talking to him. When school started, they said, it would be easier with an American name, though it wasn't official. His birth certificate, Kay explained, still said Deming Guo. "Time to get up now. We'll be leaving for church in an hour and a half." From downstairs wafted breakfasty odors, eggs and sausage and salty grease. Deming's stomach grumbled. In those early days, he called them nothing, spoke to them without saying either Kay and Peter or Mom and Dad. When Kay leaned in for hugs, Deming wiggled away, her hold too tight, the Wilkinson smelling like cheese and flowers, bitter and sugary sweet. But other times, he lingered. "We're glad you're here, Daniel," Kay would say in English, then perform shapeless approximations of Mandarin words. She had learned some Chinese phrases, taken Mandarin classes, and bought a Chinese-English dictionary, but her tones were so off-kilter that Deming couldn't understand what she was saying. "I don't know who you are," he'd respond in Fujianese. When he spoke Chinese, Peter's leg would bounce, and Kay's lips would press even thinner, as if they were being sucked into her body, her mouth consuming itself. "English," Peter would warn, concerned that Deming wouldn't be fluent enough for school, as if the English he spoke was tainted. His mother used to swat at his shoulders in a way that looked playful but felt serious when he spoke too much English and not enough Chinese. His weapon of choice had been the language that made her dependent on him. The giant windows, the yard outside with its large, gnarled trees, no sidewalks on Oak Street. Hours could pass without a car going by, the absence of overt sound, a trickle of gauzy peach. Deming would stand at the window and listen to the languid chirp of birds, the dim roar of a distant lawnmower. The air maintained a steady, nearly indiscernible buzz. Peach-brown gauze swept over his eyelashes. In a corner of his new room was a pile-up of plastic games, action figures of muscular men with swords, sturdy fire trucks and police cars with miniature sirens, toys Peter and Kay said were his. But playing cops didn't interest him. There was nothing fun about screeching sirens. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Can we give Lisa another round of applause? Yay! Thank you so much. The next writer I'd like to introduce is Jean Kwok. Jean Kwok is the award-winning New York Times and international best-selling author of Searching for Sylvie Lee, which was named one of the most anticipated books of the year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Nylon, Marie Claire, and the Huffington Post. Her past books include Girl in Translation and Mambo in Chinatown. Her work has been published in 18 countries and taught in universities, colleges, and high schools across the world. She has been selected for many honors, including the American Library Association Alex Award and the Chinese Librarians Association Best Book Award and the Sunday Times Short Story Award International Shortlist. You can read an interview with her in AAWW's Open City. Please give a big round of applause for Jean Kwok.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here tonight. And the support for this book has been so tremendous. You know, it hit more than 40 must-read lists before it was published. And of course, the Today Show pick was an incredible, huge honor. But despite the book tour and despite all of these things, didn't feel like the book was really launched until tonight when I'm back at my beloved AAWW, where it all began. You know, you guys supported me when I was like a little unknown, unwanted writer. It was the only place that would publish me. And they've been a home to me and many other writers like me ever since. So their work is incredibly important. And of course, I'm here with friends and family and so on. So thank you all so much for being here. Of course, it's also tremendous to be able to read with the great Lisa Ko and Marie Lee. So I'm just thrilled. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from the new book, Searching from Sylvie Lee. And for those of you who don't know, it's basically about these long buried secrets that tie together three women, a mother and her two daughters. And it's about what happens to this Chinese immigrant family when the dazzling, golden, brilliant older sister disappears while on a trip to the Netherlands. And her timid, shy younger sister has to pull herself together and try to find out what happened to her beloved sister. So that's the basic premise of the novel. And the book has hit a lot of mystery and suspense lists, which I'm thrilled about. But I really set out to write a page turner, but a page turner really about language and culture and immigration. And what I was thinking when I wrote the book was that about how, my mother never really learned how to speak English. And this book is inspired by the real life disappearance of my very beloved brother. So that is the beating emotional heart of this novel. My mother never learned to speak English, and I was always amazed by how very different she was in Chinese and from the perspective of someone who didn't speak Chinese, from behind the curtain of language. And I thought about how could we have the reader perceive that and understand that so that, they in some ways they have a full understanding of who everyone is. So I set it up like a mystery. The story is told by Sylvie, the dazzling older sister, Amy, the younger sister, and Ma, the mother. And before the story begins, Sylvie when Sylvie was born, her parents were so poor that they had to send her back to her grandmother because they could not afford to take care of her. And this is something that actually happens. I know people who have had it happen to them, and I know people who did it to their children because they felt they had no choice. And so she was sent back to her grandmother just until her parents could afford to keep her and to not work 24/7. But her grandmother had already emigrated to the Netherlands with other family. So Sylvie wound up living the first 9 years of her life in the Netherlands. And by that point, her little sister Amy was born. Amy was 2, and they brought Sylvie back to the U.S., and Sylvie grew up in the U.S. after that. But of course, Sylvie always secretly wondered, yes, did you only bring me back because you needed a babysitter, since you didn't want me before? So when the story opens, the grandmother in the Netherlands is dying, and Sylvie goes there to say goodbye to her, and that's when she vanishes. So Sylvie's story is told in Dutch. She's thinking in Dutch, even though the book is written in English. And because that's the language of her heart. And Ma's story is told in Chinese, and Amy's is told in English. And Sylvie's story is backdated a month. So as Amy is finding clues as to what happened to Sylvie, we see Sylvie taking off, not knowing that she's going to disappear, and we can follow along with her adventures as she proceeds on her journey. So part of what I was interested in was giving the reader clues that actually the characters didn't have. The reader is the detective in this novel because we're the only people who speak all 3 languages, who can look inside all 3 characters and get the full picture. And so we're going to see Amy. I'm going to read 2 pages from Amy's chapter. We're going to see Amy see Ma, her beloved Ma, through English-speaking Amy's eyes. And then we're going to open into Ma's chapter, where Ma's actually speaking in Chinese. And we're going to see who Ma actually is, and if that's the same person Amy sees. So from Amy's chapter. I quickly put on my glasses and hurry to the dry cleaners where Ma works. The faint smell of steam and chemicals engulfs me as I push open the door. I find Ma standing behind the long counter, talking in her broken English to a well-dressed woman with sleek, honey blonde hair. We were quite horrified to find one of the buttons loose after we picked this up, the customer says, pushing a man's pinstripe shirt toward Ma. So sorry. Ma's small face looks wan and pale against her black clothing, her eyes puffy from crying because Grandma has just died. I fix. The woman taps a manicured nail against the countertop. Her tone is both irritated and condescending, as if she's speaking to a child who has misbehaved. It's not really the quality we expect, especially after your prices went up. So sorry, Ma repeats. I glare at the woman's bony back. I want to tell her that the owner hooked up the prices. Ma had nothing to do with it. She's never even gotten a raise in all the long years she's worked here, standing on her feet all day, lifting heavy bundles of clothing, steaming, ironing, and mending. But I keep my mouth shut. I wait until the customer finishes berating Ma and leaves. A smile lights up Ma's face despite her grief when she sees me. Even though I can understand some Chinese, I never learned to speak it well, so Ma always talks to me in English. Amy, why are you here? I had resolved not to worry her, but I find myself grabbing her wrist, crumpling her thin polyester blouse. Cousin Lucas just called. He says Sylvie flew home this past weekend, but she's not picking up her phone. Ayya! Ma covers her mouth with her other hand. Her large dark eyes show too much white. She not tell us she coming home. She must be okay. Just a mistake. You call Jim? Jim is Sylvie's husband. I tried all the way here, but he's not answering. There haven't been any plane crashes or anything, right? Of course not. What you saying? Ma brushes her forehead 3 times with her delicate left hand to ward off the evil of the words I just uttered. She stares at me until I lean in so she can do the same to me. We're almost exactly the same height, and when I catch sight of our reflections in the store mirror, I'm reminded of how much we look alike, except that I wear thick glasses and can't compare to the photos of Ma in her youth. She'd been the loveliest girl in our village in Guangdong. Now in her 50s, her skin is still fine with only a light etching of lines, a silky cream that sets off her warm eyes, and there's something gentle yet wild in her gaze, like a deer in the woods. You go to their place, see what happening. Use the key in dry ginger jar at home. I have my own key. Sylvie gave it to me before she left. But are you sure, Ma? I cringe at the thought of entering Sylvie's house without permission. My mind races. What if Jim's there? What's happening to us? What could have happened to Sylvie? Sure, she says. You go now, quick. Now we go into Ma's chapter, and in Ma's own voice and in her own Chinese inner dialogue. I was as ignorant as the frog at the bottom of the well when I let Sylvie return to Holland. How many times must I surrender my daughter to that land of wind and fog and loss? She already spent the first 9 years of her life there, and then, 1 moon ago, when she heard my Ma, her grandma, was facing death, she rushed to book her ticket for Amsterdam. Sylvie was but a leaf, withering from homesickness, fluttering downward to return to the roots of its own tree. I was so busy with Mrs. Hawkins, whose fair skin hid ugly features, that I did not notice when Amy entered the dry cleaners. My poor younger girl, her face stunned with fear, chewing on her chapped lips without realizing. I did not want to reveal my heart burdens to her, especially since she was wearing her eye lenses for once. Her heart knows enough as it is. I sat down to sew tighter the button Mrs. Hawkins complained about. I had shown it to Mr. Hawkins when he picked up the shirt, and he had said it was not a problem. But he must be more than 60 years old, and Mrs. Hawkins closer to 40. He is an old cow eating young grass, and so he must pay the price for his pleasure. As I worked, my mind wandered back to the blackest time in my life. It was more than 30 years ago when I gave my 6-month-old Sylvie to Grandma to be raised in Holland. The worst thing about it was that I knew what I was doing. I had no excuse. Ma and I had just moved to the beautiful country, which we hopefully called the Gold Mountain, and on all sides were the songs of Chu. We were isolated and without help. I already had the big stomach with Sylvie. There was no way to mend the pen after the goats were lost. Neither of us could speak a word of the brave language, English. Pa hunched over his bowl of bare rice with no meat or vegetables, only soy sauce, hiding his hands with his roughened hand as he ate. He still loved me then, with the innocence of his green years, and the hollows of his young face filled with guilt rather than accusation when he gazed at me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. Let's give Jean another round of applause. We are going to move into our moderated conversation, but I would like to introduce our moderator, Marie Lee, first. Marie Lee is a graduate of Brown University, where she taught for 15 years. She is the author of the novel Somebody's Daughter. Her next book is forthcoming from Simon & Schuster. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Slate, The Guardian, The Nation, The Atlantic, and Salon. She teaches creative writing at Columbia University and is a founder and former board president of the Asian American Writers Workshop. Marie is also a current New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow. Please give Marie and our readers a big round of applause.
I have to make a karaoke joke every single time I get one of these mics at a reading. I feel like we're going to sing.
You don't want me to sing.
Not me either.
This is great. And thank you so much for coming. I don't know if I've been more excited about a book launch than this book in a long time. And I also had the pleasure of rereading Lisa's book. And the thing I have to mention to you that is so weird, I was just at a residency and naming Deming Daniel Wilkinson is the whitest character ever. There was actually a guy there named Daniel Wilkinson.
Oh my God, no way.
And he was the whitest guy ever.
What was he like? I love it.
It was just the strangest, weird, coincidence. So what I've done is I'm going to really talk in generalities, so not to give away the plot spoilers in these books that are so tightly and wonderfully plotted for people who haven't had the pleasure of reading them and they are for sale. So what I want to start with is about how both of your work really upends sort of traditional expectations of storytelling, because they both use non-linear narratives. There's multiple voices, and the voices also aren't always symmetric, and there's quick jumps, there's forward and back. And what's kind of a really meta moment that I found in Jean's book is it comes near the end and it says, as Sylvie told me once, we are all ultimately unreliable storytellers of our own lives, whether we wish it or so or not, whether we share a common language or not. The only reliable narrators are to be found in books. You have to read it and see. So what I'm going to start with as a question for you guys is a really basic question that I know that you get asked within the first 3 minutes whenever you do a reading. But I have a sort of method in my madness, because question 1 is going to lead into question 2. So how do you get your ideas? I want to know what the spark of each one of these, do you always hit it on it right away? Do you work on something else? Or, how did these 2 books come about?
Well, I basically write from trauma to trauma. I think those of you who know me know this. So I find that for me to go through, I'm not a natural marathon runner, and a book is a marathon. So for me to get from beginning to end of a book, I need to be deeply emotionally committed to the book in some way. So from my very first novel, Girl in Translation, they've all been about things that have mattered deeply to me. And, you know, some of you may know I was very poor when we moved from from Hong Kong to New York. And my brother Kwan was really the one who showed me the way out of that poverty. You know, he was the one who took care of me. He gave me a blank diary when I was still working in a factory as a child. And when he gave me that diary, he said, whatever you write in this will belong to you. And that was just so powerful to a working class girl who didn't even speak the language here. And so, you know, he was a really important person in my life. And then he, as we grew a little bit older, he got into MIT and he kind of showed me there was a way out of this cycle of poverty. And later on, I also went to Harvard and Columbia. But just as my first book was being published, it was very successful when it came out. So it was kind of like all my dreams were coming true. My brother disappeared. And he disappeared in an airplane crash. And because that happened, so it was like the best thing in my life and the worst thing in my life happening at the same time. And, you know, in my family, some of my family are actually here. So this is the first time I'm giving this talk with some of my family here. In my family, I was not like the golden girl. You know, I was actually a very much a disaster as a Chinese daughter because I'm a terrible cook, I'm a terrible housekeeper, I'm not very obedient, you know, so and not very good at listening and all of those things. So any one of my family who's here can testify to this. So I was not like the golden girl at all in my family. And I'm also a girl and the youngest of 7, which put me at the very bottom of the Chinese hierarchy. My brother was the one that everyone looked up to, and deservedly, because he was really brilliant and competent. And he was the one that we always called for help and who always knew what to do. And so when he disappeared, it was like, oh, now what? And kind of like Amy in Searching for Sylvie Lee, I had to pull it together and try to figure out what had happened to him and try to take his place in a way.
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to how the Leavers started about 10 years ago last month. So it took me about 7 to 8 years to finish the novel. And it was originally, you know, sparked by real life stories of undocumented immigrant parents being forcibly separated from their US-born children by US courts. So things that have been going on for a very, very long time that we're hearing more and more about in the news today. But I found myself really obsessed with a particular story that I'd read in the Times about 10 years ago about an undocumented Chinese immigrant who'd been found in a detention center for over 2 years. And her son had been adopted by a white Canadian family. And so there was a lot of similar cases that I had read about where that was happening. And I think they really kind of hooked into some of my own obsessions. I think I really write from a place of obsession, especially when you're working on something for 7 to 8 years. It's got to be, you know, you're not only writing to figure out what the story's about, but in some ways you're writing to answer questions in your own life. So I often think about how, as a fiction writer, I say that, you know, I hate writing memoir, like I can never do it. I like to write fiction because I can make shit up. But in reality, even if we're writing about people who are like made up, you know, the central questions are things I think that really interest us for a particular reason, right? So when I was reading these real life stories, I was very interested in these kinds of questions about assimilation, forced assimilation, U.S. history and histories of violence, and kind of, you know, the intersection between the prison industrial complex and immigration policy, and just kind of also larger thematic questions about belonging and family and identity and music and language. So I think these are really ongoing obsessions in my life, and the novel is sort of one particular storytelling manifestation of them.
Okay, so well then, moving on from theme, my curiosity is how both of you are choosing to tell your stories in terms of structure. And I'm referring to an interview that Vietnamese-American author Ocean Vuong really recently talked about in his novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And in this interview, he talks about how he uses something called Kishio Tenketsu, which is a classical structure of East Asian narratives that does not rely on conflict to tell a story. So in this interview, Vuong told Kevin Nguyen for the New York Times that, this is his quote, "It insists that a narrative structure can survive and thrive on proximity alone. Proximity builds tension." So how I also thought of both of yours is that, so, you know, in the idea of how we think of storytelling, just sort of like how you learn at school, is like there's a conflict, like the stranger comes to town, and then there's action, and you do everything in scene, and everything happens. But what I was really struck with both of yours is that you kind of ignore a lot of rules. You know, since I teach creative writing, I also kind of try to be more open about how students tell stories, but it also reminds me of how my peers will often, because the students will sort of say to me, "Oh, but Professor so-and-so said never use a flashback," or "it always has to be chronological," and so forth. So I'm kind of curious, I guess at a macro level, if perhaps first, like the why you chose like the certain structures that you did, especially some of the cuts are like forward and backward. And then also perhaps if there is anything in your mind that this could be sort of like an expansion of a way to tell a story apart from sort of the westernized way, or even like in terms of readability and accessibility, it has to be chronological and never use flashbacks. I would just love to hear like the kind of choices you made about structure.
I love these like super nerdy writer questions. They're my favorite. They're my favorite. I read that Ocean Vuong article too, and I love that quote. I actually copied it down and wrote it, and like in a document I was working on. And I think, yeah, it was really interesting because I was thinking too about the idea of just like, or thinking cinematically in literature too, just the different ways that movies and other visual forms use like montage and collage and sort of like association, and how that can be also a form of plot and structure as well. I think for the levers, I was really trying to figure out for a long time what the structure would be, and I just sort of experimented and tried and failed with every possible combination. I think that's really how I got there. So, you know, different. I knew I wanted a dual narrative because both the characters felt very important to me, and the sort of, you know, it felt that the story was really about their separation and the impact it had on their lives. But I kind of finally settled on the idea of the adult Deming searching for the truth as sort of that narrative quest. But, you know, in order to kind of add a little more tension or like trajectory, it became more interesting to sort of have different characters and different times put up next to each other, so the reader then has the mystery of kind of like, how did the character get from here to there? Like, how did Deming become Daniel? How did this child become this adult? And kind of that becomes sort of the mystery as well. And it also became a way to like show the reader and Deming the truth behind Polly's disappearance, because she actually narrates her story in the first person, addressing Deming as you, while he's in the third person.
Yeah, well, the question of narrative structure is something that I've thought about a lot. And in my earlier books, my first two novels, I stuck with one narrator because I tend to be easily confused when I'm reading. And so when there are a lot of narrators, it gets a little hard for me. And then I get like pulled because I'm so invested in one situation, and then suddenly I'm somewhere else, and I find it a little bit jarring. So with this book, actually the solution for me was when I realized I could backdate Sylvie's story by a month. And if I backdated Sylvie by a month, then what happens to the book is that we are revolving around the same issue for the entire book. We're trying to figure out what happened to her, but we're looking at it, we're casting light from all different perspectives. And then what winds up happening is that the reader is the detective, because the reader is getting clues from every single one of those narratives. And then, like Marie very cleverly picked out a kind of key phrase from my book was that I realized I was writing this, that actually there are no reliable narrators because none of us are reliable narrators. You know, we are constantly shaping and reshaping the story of our own lives to fit whatever decision we want to make. You know, if we're in love with someone and we want to stay with him, we're going to be like, yes, but he gave me flowers on Valentine's Day, and he did this and this and this, and it all builds up to like a court case that we should stay with him. But if we're ready to go, we see someone hotter down the street, we're like, well, you know, he's really not that attentive, and he doesn't go to the gym that much. You know, it's getting a little pudgy down there. So it's kind of like, you know, we're constantly kind of reshaping the story of our lives. And then in an immigrant family, which is of course my own obsession, you know, that's exacerbated by the fact that you have a language gap. That so often within one family, you know, the children learn English better than that becomes their language, and adults don't master it. And then you have this incredible gulf within one family because the parents no longer speak the same language as their own children. So in some ways, I think the, you know, Searching for Sylvie Lee is about the realization of the American dream, but also what is the price of the American dream? Who pays that price? And a part of that payment are those parents actually losing their own kids. So that all came to light when I designed the narrative of the novel. And I think that, you know, for the writers out there, I think that it is important to study the rules and study how things are done. But then once you're really writing your book, you know, you have to be guided by your own instinct. And I am constantly thinking about the writer. I'm not the writer, the reader, the reader's experience. I want the reader to have a great time. I want the reader to be entertained from beginning to end. And I want the reader to constantly be getting new information that's a little bit worrying, that's a little bit, you know, intriguing. Questions are being answered, but new questions are being posed. And so that's my focus, not any other sort of rules. So just to give one last example, like in one of Amy's chapters, she meets a guy, and for her it's a perfectly innocent, even a romantic meeting, but we, the reader, know that this guy was in Sylvie's life and had a relationship with Sylvie. So we're thinking, what is he doing in Amy's life? And why is he not telling her that he actually knew the only other Asian person in the village? You know, it's like, why, what? And then we are worried while she's not. And so I think that creates a very interesting tension.
You also, what I love too, is that you are using just other random media sources, things like newspapers, because in a way, you know, when you're young, you always feel like, oh, what's on the news is real. Like there are also these more questions, the layers of what's real or not. So it's not just getting more information, but even from these things that are fixed, like these reports, you realize that there's a certain instability in the text, which just made it, like, the more you read, like, the more you get, there are more layers. And that's what I loved, which is going to lead me to the next question, about language. Here's where I feel like the two books of yours differ a little bit. So in The Leavers, I kind of felt like it was more of a, like, Deming's experience is, to me, seemed more seamless in terms of the two cultures. Like, it seemed more integrated. And then this also brings us to questions like, do you italicize the Chinese words or not? That's kind of this, like, a secondary question I have for you. And then, but in your book, it would kind of like call the attention to the language, particularly in the idea of how I felt some of it was, particularly it was like the Chinese that seemed to be translated to Dutch and then into English. I just thought that was such an amazing feat of just, I don't know how you did that. So I just want to talk a little bit about how you guys decided when you're trying, like, what Lisa was talking about, like the double consciousness, like how do you try to impart that to the reader when, especially when they don't know, they might know or may not. Like, so that's the thing is, you know, do you italicize kimchi? Everyone eats kimchi, right? Or, you know what I'm saying? Like, as a writer, that's just an ongoing curiosity of mine.
So my book is really about being against italicization. It's about making it no longer necessary. And it's because, of course, you know, I realized from my first novel, Girl in Translation, I started this process. Well, I thought, you know, how is a foreign language represented in American literature? By a few italicized words in the other language. You know, it's like if you have a little ciao in there, it means the whole thing was in Italian, right? But that is not at all how a bilingual or a multilingual person experiences that language. That's not at all how we hear that language. And so I set out to kind of reinvent a way to get around the italics where we are just in their heads. We are so in our narrators' heads that we ourselves become native speakers of those languages. And so that's why in this novel, the only italics I think are like when people are thinking, are, you know, clearly thinking some kind of question, but there are very few italics because it's about how we experience language as trilingual readers. When you're reading my book, you will become trilingual. You will be able to speak Dutch and Chinese like a native. Yeah, exactly. And you experience the Netherlands like Sylvie does. You experience it like a native speaker. So that's kind of what I was trying to do with language.
Yeah, it's really great to be fluent in Dutch now after I've read Jean's book.
Her Dutch is excellent.
All it takes. Yeah, I too am against italicization when it comes to language. I feel like visually it feels really disruptive. And then I think politically it also just is really misrepresentative of the way, like as you said, you know, multilingual families and people talk. I mean, I grew up in a family that was like English, Chinglish, Toglish, and you know, my parents spoke in like 4 different dialects in one sentence with English. You know, so that was like a really natural way, I think, of just hearing language. So I definitely didn't want to do that. But also, I was writing about Fujianese characters as a non-Fujianese speaker, right? So I felt that my ability to represent the language was not something that I felt totally comfortable with. So I just kind of settled on having the characters speak in a version of English that felt true to the style of communication that they would have in their native language. And Deming is very much an Asian American character, so he's kind of fluent in both, going back and forth, and comfortable kind of, as a New Yorker, I guess.
And I also loved it. I think there was something about, when the woman's speaking like bad Mandarin, like you're not like kind of trying to vocalize it. And then but Deming also thinks of when he hears Fujianese, I think again, he just sort of hears these rounded vowels. And that was enough for me emotionally to just understand what he's saying, as opposed to like you trying to transliterate something. So that was just really beautiful. So for my last question, comment before we open it up for questions, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions, is the other reason, you guys are friends and that this is the Asian American Writers Workshop. I think that's just been so wonderful for me. And I like to kind of always put this into context because so many of my students, and an internship here is such a prized thing for my students at Columbia, and everyone thinks it's wonderful. And I kind of have to, I don't like to call attention, to my age, but having to say, this didn't always exist. Like before this started, there was nothing. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about community and how, so this whole thing this is probably about the 5th iteration. In fact, I was walking on St. Mark's and I saw one of our old hideouts. I don't know if you guys have been in the one at St. Mark's. I was laughing because I was texting Curtis, who was basically our original founder. I was like, Curtis, it's still Asian. It's like an Asian massage parlor now or something, but it's still there. Before that, it was like Crunch Fitness. But really, before this wonderful place existed, we were just a bunch of dorks. We're all pre-med, and we all secretly wanted to be writers. And we were just meeting at some diner, exchanging our silly little stories, and not daring to dream until we just had our first reading. It was at the Chinatown History Museum, and so many people showed up. And this is before the internet. They just had something called the Poetry Calendar, which is this tiny, tiny printed thing that they would just give out. But so many people showed up that the fire department had to close it down. And that was the first time where, when Curtis said we should incorporate, we should become like a thing, or we actually decided, that this might be something. And so my question to both of you, because it's kind of interesting since you were both, here first and kind of at the workshop, but then Jean, now you're based in Amsterdam, but then Lisa's still here in New York. I'm just curious about, what is your relationship to having a community of Asian American writers, around you? Is that necessary? Or I don't know, just how does that, the early experiences here, like how do you sort of function or take energy from the community?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I think I probably wouldn't be a writer, or I wouldn't have published a novel if the workshop didn't exist, or it would have taken me even longer than it already did, which was a really long time. I've been writing, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I've been writing stories since I was like 5 years old. I never tried to be pre-med in any way. But I never, I didn't grow up in a family where that was like an acceptable thing, or there was any kind of roadmap for that. I didn't see it. Also not to put too much attention on my age, but I was an intern here in 1996 when I was in college at 37 St. Mark's, and it was so life-changing. I remember, meeting other Asian American authors. I did my first reading, and it was like I saw an example of what a working writer could be, who came from a family like mine, who didn't kind of have a family that grew up reading The New Yorker and was like, you be an English major and get an MFA, so like seeing that and made it, I think, possible, I think, for me. So it was really important. And the workshop has supported me in so many ways, like with the Van Lier Fellowship. I worked for them for a while, and full circle, I'm now a mentor for in the Margins program this year. So it feels really amazing to sort of still be connected in that community and still have friends that I've known for over 20 years here in the city and around the world.
Oh, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I think there were, when we first started, our whole idea was, access for Asian Americans who wanted to do a writer's workshop. And I think yours was the class. So one of the first things we did was we had like low cost writer's workshops for people so anyone could just come and hang out and write. I think you were in sort of the group that was with Edlin, Minjin Lee.
Oh yeah.
And then we had, and Kathy Park Hong. And then we asked this rising writer who wasn't very known at the time, Jumpali Hiri, to teach.
Yes.
Is that your class?
Yeah, Ed, Min, and Kathy and I were students in Jumpali Hiri's class.
Kathy
before we had all published our books.
And Jumpali Hiri she had not won her prizes yet.
Yeah, she was just about to win the Pulitzer. But yeah, so I always think back on that and how amazing it was. Just like having the opportunity to like get to know these writers who are now doing amazing things and like reading, first drafts of their books to be, over 20 years ago.
And no, I do think that it's easy to take for granted how far we've come. And it's true that when the AAWW first started, there was really very little support for voices of people of color, and especially for Asian American voices. And, it's kind of like Crazy Rich Asians. That movie has just broken the barriers open for movies about books like ours. And before that, people were always interested in film rights for my books, but they could never get that far because the funding just wasn't there. And publishing used to be like that too. I mean, not that long ago. It was just that people did not believe there was a market for books and voices like ours. And then the AAWW was a support network, and an incredibly important one, where we could meet each other and, kind of know that maybe what we were doing was valuable.
I think we're going to start opening it up for questions.
So I kind of had to write my question down because it's a bit long-winded. But first of all, thank you for all of the works that you've done. It's incredible reading a book and realizing that that's my story too that's being told. And I've been reading since I was a child, of course, and I love books. And now seeing books today that I can relate to, that's actually my history. It's incredible. One of the things I want to ask all three of you, though, is that with the explosion of Asian American stories being told today, like both of your novels and also Little Fires Everywhere, Nicole Chung's memoir, All You Can Ever Know, this question that's constantly being raised is the gulf between the parents and the child, or between being an Asian and then between an American. There's always that divide. And this idea that I also went through is that we kind of lose our heritage. As like, I can never just say I'm Chinese. I also have to say I'm American Chinese because I kind of lost a little bit of my Chinese heritage. And this is an issue that so many people face. And I kind of wonder about your opinion of kind of like losing yourself in this situation. Did that make sense? I hope that made sense.
Well, I think that that's a part of life, you know. I mean, it's of course, I do think it's important to hold on to our heritage. I think that's why it's so important to have voices that are telling our stories. And, you know, at the gulf between parents and children, well, you know, immigrants or not, it's always going to exist, sadly. You know, I have kids myself. So, you know, that does happen. But of course, that is exacerbated in an immigrant situation. And I think the very fact that you're asking that question is a great sign. It means that we are aware and that we are thinking and that we don't want to lose our heritage. And I think that I don't believe in holding on to the past just because it's the way hundreds of thousands of years of people have done it. But I do believe in choosing and realizing that we have a very rich background and to keep the things that are valuable and to continue onward while holding those things that are valuable and maybe letting go of the things that are maybe more painful or less useful to us in this modern environment. And we do also need to adapt.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, migration comes with so much loss. But I think, you know, one thing that I'm also really interested in is kind of thinking about not only like an either or dichotomy of identity, but also like a both and what that kind of third space might look like. So in my book and a lot of my writing, I try to think about like an Asian America as a place or as a culture, even though the term itself is like loaded and problematic and, you know, exclusionary in so many ways. But just that, you know, thinking of, you know, in the book, Deming is often seen as like not American, but then what does American look like? Or like, you know, not Asian, but what does that look like? And so kind of just like pushing myself to think of what it would mean to be Asian American and what that looks like, what have we contributed. And it's also interesting to think about it too as, you know, Asian Americans have been living here for even more generations, right? So now like post 1965 Immigration Act, which is when a lot of my parents came and a lot of my friends' parents came, but now, you know, we're moving into like third and fourth generations after that. So I'm looking forward to kind of seeing how that'll shift as well culturally, right?
And similarly, experiences, you know, Viet Thanh Nguyen talked about something called narrative plenitude. It's less about, oh, we have the immigrant novel, we have, you know, this novel, we have the mystery, Asian American mystery. It's really about plenitude. And so, you know, for instance, in my forthcoming novel, it's actually about a guy who's kind of a doofus and he's completely assimilated and kind of why that occurs. But that's his story too. So that's an Asian American story as well. So I think in terms of, we should really feel free to be true to the experience we're just trying to impart, and that in itself is an Asian American experience. So you don't have to, you know, one of our jokes when we started the workshop is we were so sick of everyone going, how come you're not writing about rice in your story? And do you know what I mean? Like, we just wanted to get past that because our experiences, whatever we wanted to do or whatever dystopian mystery, hard-boiled comedy novel, that is, you know, just implicitly Asian American. So you should also just feel that would hope you shouldn't feel that, you know, there are forebears that we pay tribute to, but you shouldn't feel constrained that, you know, even, you know, you don't even have to have Asian American characters in your story. That's fine. It's still Asian American story, if you know what I mean. So that's my 2 cents.
So we have someone's asking a question on the live stream, and it's like 2 questions in one. So it says it's a question for both Lisa and Jean. So maybe one of you can answer the first one, and then one of you can answer the second one. The first one is pretty vague. It's how do you develop dialogue, deciding on the tones and word choices for each characters? And then the second question is when you have writer's block, how do you use your obsessions to help overcome the struggles of writing?
All right. So I'll do the one about dialogue. How do you develop dialogue? I think that she was like, you do the dialogue one. That's like, okay, I'll do it. All right. So the thing about dialogue is that, you should be able to know who is saying that line without the tag. So that's the hard part. The voice should be so distinctive that you know who that character is, even if it doesn't said Amy, for example. And I was very aware of that in my novel with the three voices, so that, there were certain conventions I developed for myself just to keep them separate. So Amy, also always talks in present tense. Sylvie is in past, and Sylvie, because she's thinking in Dutch, and Dutch doesn't use contractions, she doesn't use contractions. Ma is also past tense. She also does not use contractions because she's not thinking in English. And it's all of those kind of things. And you also need to cut dialogue down to its bare essential. You can't just kind of record someone at Starbucks and transcribe it, because that's not going to be interesting to read. So you need to distill it to its essence. And I think sometimes you maybe need to cut the obvious. That if something is if it's clear that the answer is going to be no, you don't have the character say no. You just cut the scene and you go on to the next thing. And the reader knows they said no. So I think there's a kind of, assumption of intelligence on the part of the reader. You need to make it challenging for the reader, and you have to not make the dialogue cumbersome, so that, since basically my entire book is, whole parts of it are in another language, I was very aware of that I wanted the book to be still a fun, fast read. So I wanted the Dutch and English parts to feel slightly foreign, but not in a way that was burdensome, because of course there's nothing more painful than like reading a page of dialect. You just want to kill the author by the end of that page. And so I didn't want any lynching mobs coming after me, and I made sure that I tried to make sure that it was flavoring, but not that it was hard, or you have to kind of trek through it in order to read it. And in the parts where the action picks up and the mystery picks up, I lighten up on the language thing on purpose. I know the reader wants the story just to move, and I don't start inserting a million idioms from other languages, because I know the reader wants the speed at that point. So I think that all of those things are factors that go into writing great dialogue.
I knew you were the person to answer that question.
She just didn't want to answer it. Okay,
Such a good
all
answer.
Right.
Oh wait, what was it? It was about writer's block. What do I do with writer's block? Oh my god. I don't know. Let's see. What can I admit in public? My latest technique for dealing with writer's block is to cut and paste my novel from Scrivener to Word, back again, and back
too.
and back again, because I'm convinced that putting it in a different format will change my relationship to it, and I'll be able to see things that are wrong and fix them. Sometimes I change the font too. I don't know if that really works. Just a little admission. I think probably every other day I wake up in the morning and I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I have to relearn it. Almost every single time I sit down to write, even though I've been doing it for decades, I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, and then I'm like, oh wait, I do. So it's always this kind of continual learning process, and kind of like amnesia and remembering, and amnesia and remembering. But one of my favorite things to do, actually, when I do feel stuck, is to actually just see other forms of art that inspire me that are not text-based. So that's one of my favorite things to do. I watch movies. I love TV. I see a lot of visual art, just giant things of color are really soothing to my eyes, or video, or just something that isn't text, that still kind of maybe plays into some of the same obsessions or interests, and usually kind of helps my brain see things in a new way.
And just to add to that cutting pasting thing, a trick I have for writer's block is I don't want my words to feel lonely. The blank page is so intimidating. So I'll start writing in the middle of a file. I'll just, take an old file and go in the middle. And so, otherwise the words get lonely. And that way they're among all other words and they feel better.
there are certain sentences. Your stories are so compelling, and I can hardly wait to read. There were certain sentences as you're reading out loud that really jumped out at me. So what I'm wondering is that how important is language in these very, I mean, you're telling us a story. So on one hand, I'm thinking the story is most important. So is the beauty of the language, is that at all an issue as you're writing this?
Thank you, first of all. Yeah, I think I'm really interested in language, and it's really important to me as well as story. So I edit, obsessively. I read everything out loud several times, and I'm really interested too in how sentences sound and look on the page. So sort of the rhythm of the words and the phrases, as well as how they visually appear, I think, are things that I think a lot about in the revision process. I like to read a lot of poetry. I think that I don't really understand it, but I love poets for what they can do and their attention to language. So yeah, I'm always kind of thinking about how can I be better in terms of language.
I think one of the funnest things about being a writer and writing is that sometimes you can stun yourself by writing something that's beautiful, and it's like a total shock to you because you'll see it is, because you will like say some truth that you didn't know you knew, but your character knew it or your writing self knew it. I think that when you write, I think my truest self is actually in my writing, and it's not in the person who interacts day to day or talks to you. And that self says things sometimes that I had no idea I knew, and that I actually didn't know. And so, I mean, on the one hand, I do plot my stories very carefully. I think a lot about where I'm going. I don't just meander around with beautiful writing. But once you're really in a character's voice and the character has her own voice, that voice leads you to all kinds of unexpected places, and that's kind of one of the most joyous things about writing, I find.
Have you ever taken a typo and then just gone with it?
Like left it in there on purpose?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, it's just me.
I feel like I've made up words where copy editors are like, that's not a word. I'm like, but yes, it is. It is now.
Other questions?
Hey, I was wondering, like, maybe not for, your book that just came out, but just like in general, when you write stories, like, how do you pick the perspective, and like, what are like the strengths and weaknesses you sort of weigh, or does it sort of just happen where you already know when you begin?
I think that's a really important question. I think the choice of perspective is really, really key. And, it has to do with narrative distance, how close you want to be to the person. Well, first of all, you have to pick who's going to tell the story, right? You have a kind of situation, and you have to think about who's actually going to tell the story. And the person who should tell the story is the one who suffers the most, It's like the one who's got the most at stake, who's at the central, usually, not always. There are exceptions to this, but that's how I pick. I usually pick as the narrator, or the central focus, that character who's got to go through the most. And then it's a choice of what type of voice. Do you do first person? Do you do second? Do you do third, close third? And I love first person. I think first person, the I voice, you're so close to that character, you can rewrite in their thoughts. But I think third has a lot of power as well, because then you can follow them. There's a little bit more distance. And of course, you can go into an omniscient voice, which can do a lot of other cool things with your narrative. So it depends on how, whether you want to be the all-powerful narrator, or whether you want a little distance, or whether you want, actually, what I like about first person is it's very easy to hide things from the reader, because if that voice doesn't know it, the reader doesn't know it either. But there are a lot, those are the kind of, that's the way I think about it when I choose how to write a book. My new book, the one I'm working on now, is actually going to be told in first person and in close third, because I want us to really identify with the first person character, and the close third is a more controversial character, and we're going to have a changing relationship to that character. And so it works for me to put that one in close third.
That's really interesting. I find first person really hard. Like, I really struggle with it. And I don't know, I think it feels like too intimate or too claustrophobic for me. But I also feel like, yeah, as Jean mentioned, who's telling the story, from what perspective, changes the story entirely, right? But I also feel that 99% of writing is revision, actually. So I'll very often start out telling a story one way, and then in the revision process, experiment with different voices, different points of views, different narrative distances, because part of the revision process is also figuring out what the story actually is. So it's kind of like this ongoing journey that you do just kind of by experimenting and trying out different things and kind of working your way to the truth of what you're trying to say.
And I have a great first person / publishing story. So my first novel was a young adult novel called Finding My Voice. And I actually have a lot of students who say it really was kind of a lifeline for them when they were growing up. And when I was just starting out as a writer, trying to get someone to pay attention to me, I didn't have an MFA, and it was just like a very long slog. I just quit my job trying to be a writer full time. A very prominent editor at Bantam Doubleday Dell was interested in the novel, and she said, but first person present is so amateurish, people don't use that tense, and if you rewrite it in third person, I'll probably take the book. And I just had this moment going, oh my God, she's the head editor-in-chief of Bantam Doubleday Dell, finally someone's paying attention to me. But then I intuitively didn't know why I needed it to be in first person present at the time, but I knew. And now, 20 years later, and the book is actually going to probably come back into print, which is doubly exciting to me because the same editor is someone who might buy the book, and that would be super funny because then I'll have to write an article about it. But my whole point of writing this book was trying to express what it was like for this girl who is in the sole family of color in her all-white town in northern Minnesota, what it feels like when someone calls her a chink. And the only way I could do it with that kind of immediacy is in first person present. I didn't know it at the time. But so I did tell the editor no. And it did take another year. And the last publisher, Houghton Mifflin, was the one that bought it. But in retrospect, I'm saying, that was the right voice, even though, plus I majored in economics in college. What do I know about writing? But to have someone say, first person present is the most amateur. That's what she said. It's the most amateurist tense. You just don't know what you're doing. And that was just very sort of hurtful, but it was informative for me that just still intuitively, I just still had this thing I can't do it. So I didn't. So that's just, in your gut, maybe you want to tell the story backwards. I don't know. As a writer, make a new narrative form. As a writer, you will know. And that's what you were saying, Lisa. It's all about playing with it until you have the voice that you want. So it's about knowing there are different perspectives, and half the stuff I don't even know, what's close third, when my students talk about it. But it's kind of language is pliable. You should learn the rules, and then you can play with it on your own.
I don't know if we're allowed to talk about the content of the books at all. I'm kind of curious in your novel, the concept of marrying outside your culture, which is something that I've done. Hi, honey. And and sort of how that plays into the concept of identity and self-identity and self-awareness, which sort of brings me into your novel and changing your name. And, in my case, I'm Hispanic. And so in changing my name, that sort of brought up a lot of double consciousness because people no longer assume I'm Hispanic. And so I'm kind of curious about that a little bit too.
Well, about, when I got married, I did think about, well, I didn't really think about it, but this was the reason I refused to change my name. Because I knew that if I took my husband's name, I would sound like a white person, I would have a whole different identity. And so I chose deliberately not to do that. But I do have to say, I've actually been talking to a number of people recently, including, some very famous and attractive Asian Americans who were teased terribly for having a name that was not Americanized, where they didn't choose a name like Daniel, where they kept the original name. My original Chinese name was Chen Fong. And that was changed for me when I was very young, so I was never a part of that decision to Jean. But I wonder if I had kept that. I mean, I spoke to people, nowadays it's all like, oh no, I'm so proud of my name and, I'm gonna keep it and it's a source of pride, which I think is great, but I think it's also reality that children are teased mercilessly with the ching chong thing. It happens all across America to this day. And beaten up and all kinds of bullying happens because a name is maybe too foreign sounding for their classmates, and it becomes a question of, what do you choose?
Yeah, I think of in my novel both the main characters go through significant name changes, and they're kind of done for different reasons. So Polly ends up changing her name from a Chinese name to the English name Polly when she immigrates, and it's sort of done. She decides to do it. It's like her own volition. It's kind of her way to mark a new life for herself, a new identity. And so in her case, it's sort of done out of empowerment. But for Deming, his name is sort of changed for him against his will, right? So I kind of wanted to just to look at the tension between different kinds of name changes under different circumstances and the meaning of those.
Last question.
Thank you. So this may be a question you can't answer, but in terms of endings, and how do you? Because both of you talked about how for Jean it's part of your own life story, the inspiration for your book, and Lisa some research. Are you thinking about the reader? Are you thinking about the character? Is it different, or is there a time when you figure the ending out for your books?
The ending. Yeah, I'm not going to give away the ending, but I think it took me many, many drafts to get to the ending. And in a lot of the initial drafts, I didn't even write to the ending because I think there's a lot of fear and avoidance around it. So I would just end it at this totally unresolved place. And I remember having readers look at it and be like, why doesn't anything happen after that? Like there was one version where the characters are just they get in a car and they're driving towards one another, but they never meet. And then I was like, oh yeah, I think it's because I was scared to actually write this emotionally, difficult scene. I'm totally avoiding it. So when I did get to the ending, I think it's definitely from both a storytelling and a character perspective. I want the characters to kind of reach an ending that feels good for them and who they are in the story and in their lives. And then when I figured out what the ending would be for the book, it just felt right. And I kind of knew it was the right one.
Well, I am a much more anal type than Lisa here, obviously, because I'm not so experimental. I mean, I know the ending from the very beginning. I know it. I have to know it. Because if I don't, no. No. You know why? Because if I don't know the ending, I don't see how I can build to it properly. So I am constantly interested in reader expectation, and I'm constantly interested in confounding reader expectation. So I like to predict what you're going to think at each point in the novel. And so I have to set it up. I have to set up that you think it's going to be X and then it's not. And then you think it's going to be Y, but it's also not. And it's, and what it is that in the end, I think I want to deliver an ending that is surprising but earned. So I've laid all the stones, but while I lay the stones, I was like, look at that. And hopefully you were looking at something else and you did not notice the real clue that I put there. It's all there. And then what you want is that when the reader reads that last page to say, oh my God. But it totally makes sense now. Now all the pieces fall into place, but not in the way I expected. That's what I'm trying to do. And then I have to tell you a funny story about the ending, though, which is that I did a panel at AWP before the book was published. And I was on with a bunch of really amazing writers, including one who's a professor at Northwestern, very amazing guy. I will not name him because he will kill me. But he said during the panel, he said, you know, the one thing I learned, he said, is that it's impossible to end a good book or a good story with the words, I love you. Guess what the last words in my book are? And I was like, hey, wait. He was like, it's impossible. I'm like, oh, I think it's possible. I think I found a way. I think it's hard to do it. Now you know the last line of my book. But, you know, but I do think, yeah, for me, I need to know the ending. Because if I don't know the ending, I can't set it up and I can't have it be earned and surprising. So, are we done with the questions? Okay.
Let's give a hand to our writers. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. We do have books for sale in the back and wine as well. Feel free to mingle, have some fun.